Welcome to the MTC Report, the news behind the news with journalist Mark Taylor-Canfield. We offer you independent voices and underreported stories about topics you won't hear anywhere else. Join us as we delve into the deeper issues behind the news stories of the day on the MTC Report.
This is not about politics, and I'm not a politician. This isn't a debate about First Amendment rights. This is about life or death. So we need a plan. The council legislated away officers' access to less lethal tools when in fact we had in place a temporary restraining order by Judge Jones, and we would ask and hope that they would reconsider and make our ability to respond to these incidents and use the appropriate tools available to us. No one, especially the officers, want to be in a situation where they have to use any other option. The only options left to us, which actually ends up being, our batons or a gun.
I want to make sure that I support and give Chief Best everything she needs. SPD will need the East Precinct. SPD will be returning to the East Precinct. I'll let Chief Best talk about that further. As much as I wish there could be an immediate end to all of these issues, there is not. This city and cities like us across the country are all grappling with the same realities. We have had hundreds of years of systemic injustice. It will not be undone in a day or in any one city. I am hopeful and confident that these organizations that we are in dialogue with and others will work to encourage individuals to leave voluntarily, and we're working with those organizations and community leaders to resolve that situation. Our Human Services Department is also setting in place officers of services for those individuals experiencing homelessness in the area, so we can move them to a better and safer place. And if individuals continue to remain at the park, we will be looking at additional steps to ensure community safety.
I have no idea what's going on, but I think this is basically a confrontation with the police who are telling them they have to disperse. They're in the street now, so you can expect probably rubber bullets, pepper spray, tear gas, the whole thing coming soon, folks. This is how it works in Seattle and other places around the country, apparently. So sadly, instead of sending out negotiators and public relations folks to talk to the protesters about their problems with the police department, instead they show up with robo-cops, black-clad robo-cops who have very heavy-handed tactics and sort of create fear, apprehension, and anger and intimidation of the people. And so these confrontations, it's sad that it's happening all around the country. And this is after Jenny Durkan, our mayor, came out and said that she was outraged by the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. There's a police officer with a pepper spray canister right there. I'm afraid they might be getting ready to use it on the crowd if we don't leave soon and protest, but the streets are blocked, so we can't. And that officer right there is not looking very friendly. He probably doesn't like the fact that I'm photographing him, so I will back off slowly. Oh, there's a lot of cops here. I just about fell right there. Oh my God, I just about walked right into those people. Oh. That's a state trooper too. Oh my gosh. Hi, this is Mark Taylor-Canfield for the MTC Report. My independent coverage of the Seattle protests and the Capitol Hill occupied protests continue. And you can see my latest videos up at my YouTube channel.
where there are over 430 some odd original videos now. So support independent media, subscribe, and let people know what's going on. The situation is not eased in Seattle. I know there have been protests all over the country for the last few months about the killing of young black men and women around the country by police. Well, the situation is actually more tense now in Seattle because of the fact that 3 people were shot over the weekend on Capitol Hill. So just so you know, to set the record straight, my experience is that during the day, it's actually been a very safe place to be, where families with children and local residents visit to show their solidarity with the protesters. My YouTube and Instagram videos document that. But Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkan and Seattle Police Chief Carmen are starting to sound like Donald Trump in their description of what's going on at the CHOP zone, the autonomous zone in Seattle, as it was called at one point. Which is very strange since, Jenny Durkan, our mayor, was a former U.S. attorney in the Obama administration, was on CNN just the other day defending the protest. Suddenly now she's backing off, which is not unusual for her, and is not unusual for our typical neoliberal mayors who run as progressives and then turn out to totally side with the moneyed interests and conservative interests in town, corporate interests. So it's not looking good for a peaceful resolution. It doesn't bode well because neither Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkan or Seattle Police Chief Carmen seem to be repentant at all for the fact that, the Community Police Commission has received over 15,000 complaints against the police department during these protests. So that apparently is not an issue to them. Also, the fact that the protesters have been calling for the resignation of Jenny Durkan doesn't seem to be an issue. Well, it may be. I can talk about that in a minute. But for one thing, this is going to look like a political act by the mayor and the police chief, no matter what they say. They keep saying it's not political, but it is. Because for one thing, none of the protesters' demands have been met, including their demand for Jenny Durkan's resignation. So this is going to look political, no matter how the chief and the mayor try to spin it. If they go into the autonomous zone and start arresting people or pushing them out of there, they're going to be pushing people out of there who do not support them politically and have been calling for their resignation, which in a sense is a sort of conflict of interest. And also, I have to say, it was very chilling to hear Carmen the police chief tonight, complain, actually earlier today during her press briefing, she complained that the city council had banned the use of tear gas and rubber bullets, and so that the only response that police have now to protesters are batons and guns. I don't know if that's what she meant, but that seemed to be what she was inferring. So that was interpreted by, of course, by some of the civil rights activists out in the streets and the Black Lives Matters protesters as a veiled threat. So here's the question. Will the Seattle Police Department try to blame the city council if any violence erupts when they try to take back the East Precinct from the protesters? Because that is what Mayor Jenny Durkan announced tonight. And this is what Carmen said tonight during her press briefing. They're going to take back the East Precinct. Well, the East Precinct has been surrounded by protesters for weeks now, and it's been claimed by the activists as a community center. So it's just mind-blowing what's going on here, folks. I can't even imagine what the police chief and the mayor are thinking. But after 15,000 complaints lodged against the Seattle Police Department, the Seattle Police Department, the mayor, Jenny Durkan, and the police chief, Carmen are still completely unrepentant, apparently, and seem to be ready for major clashes with Black Lives Matter protesters. And I'm amazed that they don't seem to realize that the protesters will most likely resist a reoccupation of the CHOP area by police and the reoccupation of the East Precinct, which they've claimed as their own. So the protesters have reclaimed the building as a community center, and they've surrounded it for weeks. Several community centers have been created in Seattle by protesters, by the way, in this same manner. It tends to be a tradition here. There are many community centers in the area that were claimed by people in the community who just occupied them and refused to leave. They held very lengthy sit-ins. One of those is the Central Area Motivation Program, which was an old fire station. That is a major community center for the black community in the Central District. There's also El Centro de la Raza, which is an abandoned public school, and the Hispanic community took that over. The Daystar Center, which is now a tribal center, was a former military base. And even I think Jane Fonda was involved in one of those sit-ins. So the Cascade Community Center also was an abandoned Seattle Times building, and now it's a community park with a pea patch garden and a community center. So as I said, it's been a long tradition in Seattle for members of the community to claim abandoned property. So in that sense, the Seattle protesters in the CHOP zone are just following a long tradition. So at this point, it's my impression that Mayor Jenny Durkan is going to support the Seattle Police Department, and so is Carmen Best, despite widespread criticism. And that's because Mayor Best has the business community on her side, and the Downtown Business Association, the Seattle Chamber of Commerce, etc. are her most powerful constituents. Carmen Best made it very clear tonight that she's going to stand by her officers in the Seattle Police Department no matter what, which is kind of frightening considering their past reputation. But if there is a shakeup at City Hall and Best is forced to resign as a result of more heavy-handed police tactics, then Durkan will also suffer politically, and I don't know why she doesn't realize that. By the way, I just have to set the record straight historically, because I've been covering protests for years in Seattle, and it's been a long tradition. May Day protests, Black Lives Matter protests, protests against the Trump administration, the World Trade Organization protests, which were world famous historical event here. But this same scenario keeps being repeated over and over again throughout Seattle history. And it's like this. It goes like this. Every time people gain a little bit of freedom or autonomy, then along comes the usually neoliberal crackdowns that shut it down. Not that conservatives or Republicans wouldn't do the same, but we just happen to have neoliberal politicians in the Seattle area that run as progressive and then turn out to side usually with the business community and the more conservative interests. But it happened during the Occupy Wall Street movement, and it's happening now, where we stand in front of the East Precinct today, where people stand in front of the East Precinct today. It happened during the WTO demonstrations. It's an ongoing scenario in Seattle. So we've seen this many times. Authority figures always, without exception, use the presence of crime or violence to use police force on protesters. Now, I'm not excusing any kind of violence in any way or diminishing the pain of the family that the families feel from the shooting victims up on Capitol Hill. But Seattle is a major city, and there are acts of violence here late at night, and they have nothing to do with protests. The protesters have not been shooting people, folks. I just want to make that clear, despite what impression you might get from Donald Trump or Fox News or KOMO. But here's, this is an excerpt basically from my upcoming article that talks about this, is that if the acts of violence are perpetrated by local criminals, looters, or thieves, etc., then these incidents are always, and without exception, once again, blamed on the protesters and used to undermine the credibility of the protests and their grievances. So don't be fooled by the statements from Police Chief Carmen Best or Mayor Jenny Durkan. This coming crackdown on the protests, if it happens, is absolutely political. And public safety will be the issue that they always cite and use in these cases where, basically the common people have gained the upper hand for the moment. And these public officials will lie for political purposes in an attempt to save their careers if they feel it's necessary. And they are political figures, despite what either one of them may tell you. They're both trying to hold on to their disappearing power base. So, I just wanted to set the record straight that this is an ongoing scenario that's been happening over and over again. And meanwhile, as the world watches in wonder and is very inspired, actually, by Seattle and its innovative protest movement, because this is a movement against police brutality and racism that's going on all over the world. But meanwhile, Fox News, KOMO, as I mentioned, and Donald Trump claim that the place in Seattle, the Capitol Hill Occupy protest, is occupied by terrorists. And Police Chief Best and now Mayor Durkan have signaled today during their press briefing that they are getting ready perhaps to crack some heads. And so the protesters are really on edge in the zone. Now, the corporate mainstream media, they have also sort of amplified this narrative. The corporate media is also pushing this narrative. Basically, the corporate mainstream media, the political structure, and the commercial culture will always value property and top-down control over freedom of expression, while they, scream that graffiti is violence and things like that. You can always count on that. I think that comes from an upcoming book called MTC's Guide to Authoritarians and Politicians, which authority figures and politicians, where it talks about how to deal with them. There are certain basic rules you can always count on. Like, you can always count on authoritarians and authority figures to overstep their authority, always, because they get really greedy for power, and they end up shooting themselves in the foot and causing themselves a lot of problems. Sometimes they end up having to resign, they get thrown in prison, whatever. But just remember, when I say that this crackdown on the Capitol Hill Occupy protest is political, just remember this one thing, that one of their main demands at the protest camp is, guess what? The immediate resignation of Mayor Jenny Durkan. So how would an authoritarian neoliberal react to this kind of criticism and political pressure if they were the mayor? Of course, they would send in the police force to push these people out of the park and, nullify their protest. And, what else would you expect her to do? So it's a conflict of interest, and it's going to look bad. It's going to look political no matter what, because these demands by the protesters have not been met. So, in my latest observance, the protesters were practicing creating human change around the East Precinct, so you can see where their mindset is. This is Mark Taylor-Canfield in Seattle, and I hope things stay safe and peaceful for people up here. But I'm afraid that with the rhetoric that's coming out of the mayor's office and the police department, it's not looking good right now for this kind of police reform that people were hoping for. This is Mark Taylor-Canfield reporting from Seattle, where the Seattle City Council voted to ban tear gas, pepper spray, rubber bullets, and all sorts of crowd control devices in an attempt to demilitarize the police. And now there's a pushback from the police, and it was really chilling to hear what Carmen Best had to say about that tonight. This is Mark Taylor-Canfield reporting from Seattle near the Capitol Hill occupied protest for the MTC Report.
The MTC Report, the news behind the news with journalist Mark Taylor-Canfield. We offer you independent voices and underreported stories about topics you won't hear anywhere else.
Also, check out Democracy Watch News. I wanted to mention that. I'm also executive director for a nonprofit news organization called Democracy Watch News, democracywatchnews.org. And we have a podcast where we've been following this story in depth called Democracy Cast. And it's part of our ongoing international news service, reporting on pro-democracy movements around the world. I'm also a weekly guest on the Jeff Santos Show on the Revolution Radio Network. So just go to revolutionradionetwork.com and you can see archives of all the shows there. You can also check them out at my YouTube channel. And I'm also, of course, on Instagram and Facebook, Twitter, and that kind of thing, SoundCloud. So check me out all over the place there. This is Mark Taylor-Canfield reporting from Seattle. Peace out.